Okay, so the plan with this one is to do a pretty quick painting, but trying to keep some realism in there. So I'm going to show you how to approach a painting where you're not going to be putting too much time or detail in it, but you still get that element of realism in. So I'm just working in oils. I'll show you what I've got on my palette. So it's the usual suspects. We've got a bit of sap green, hooker's green, light green, viridian hue, Naples yellow, titanium white, ultramarine blue or French ultramarine, and burnt umber. So I'm just going to start with the sky. So we've got the blocking in stage done. So if you haven't seen that, please go back to the previous video in the playlist, and that shows you how I got to this stage. But I'm just going to go over the sky, and then in this lesson, and then also build up some of the foreground, and then we'll just take it from there and see how it develops. So I'm just mixing a bit of French ultramarine with titanium white. In the blocking in stage I had Prussian blue with the acrylics, but I don't have that colour in my oil paint armoury, but French ultramarine is a very good colour, very similar. And adding a little bit of liquid in there just to help with the flow of the paint. A bit too much white in there. So if you've watched previous lessons, you'll remember me saying with the skies, if you're doing a blue sky, the strongest saturation is going to be at the top of your canvas, and as you come down it will get lighter. So always bear that in mind when if you're just doing like a flat blue sky. I mean, at the moment I'm going to keep it like this for simplicity's sake, and if you're a beginner artist, when trying to do realism, start off simple and then you can build up to skies with more detail. So just keeping the flow going with the liquid. Need a bit more titanium white. So I'm adding more and more titanium white as we come down the sky there. Just keep the flow going with the liquid, just little bits. What I use, if you can see there on my other camera, is just a jam jar lid, just to put a little bit of the liquid in. And it's just really useful just to keep it going. And the liquid will help it dry a little bit quicker as well. So as we're going down to the horizon level here, the paint's getting lighter, just more and more the titanium white in the mixture. So the aim with this one is not to be ultra detailed, but it's to show people that you can still get that level of realism in when you're using sort of fairly big brushes and you're not putting all that fine detail and taking a long time to do it. I will be doing many more of the high detailed paintings for those of you who really want to learn the techniques that I use for making almost photorealistic paintings. But this is more of an exercise to show that you can use bigger brushes but still get that effect of realism. So I'm just smoothing out imperfections here. Each time I go back into the top of the painting, I'm making sure that the brush is loaded up with the richer saturation, so we don't make it too light at the top. But you can see there, I don't know how well the camera will pick it up, but there's sort of bits and pieces where you're kind of suggesting clouds, and so you've got darker and lighter bits, and that contrast works well when we're not painting ultra details in it. So that's all I'm going to do for the sky, and we'll move on to the next bit now. Okay, that's the sky pretty much done now. It's just kind of one layer that we needed for that. I'm going to do the reflections here in the water, which is just a reflection of the sky essentially. So it's just more of the ultramarine, but what I'll do is use a bit of the burnt umber just to take the kind of blue out of it. It adds a little bit of almost a grey tinge to it. We'll see how that looks, because it won't be an exact copy of the sky in terms of the colour. Need a bit more blue in there. We may need to add a bit of violet in here and things, but where, you know, just adjust it as you go. A bit of sap green, because I say it's not going to be pure colours from the sky. So I'm just adjusting the colours as we go. Mixing a bit of sap green with the burnt umber there, because there's a dark shadowy bit where the bankside vegetation is reflected here. And it goes back to the blue. Bit more of the French ultramarine onto the palette there. Getting a little bit of liquid in. A lot of it's mixing colours up and then putting it on the canvas and assessing how close they are and then adjusting. But we can put the highlights where we've got the lighter areas in after it's dried. I'm just trying to get the rough kind of colours in there at the moment. And what makes these paintings also come alive is having those areas of difference. What you don't want is one flat colour where everything looks the same. So keep adding different bits of colour, different shades, you know, different blues, different browns, violets, all these kind of things, just to get that variety in there. And it is those contrasts that will stop your paintings looking flat. So if any of you are painting and you're wondering why your paintings are looking flat, in a lot of instances it's going to be because you're not varying your tones and your colours and your contrasts enough. And a lot of it is about understanding, you know, not only how to mix paint, but also how to actually look at your reference photos. Or, you know, if you're outdoors plein air painting and looking at the subject in front of you, you know, it's all about, and it will come with experience, you know, understanding how to actually look properly at a subject. And it's something that you'll learn over time. It doesn't necessarily come instantly for most people. It's certainly a learned skill. But it's when you want to be, observation is the key to a lot of painting. I've just mixed a bit of the Naples yellow in there with the titanium white, because there's a bit of a reflection of sun at the top of here. Trying to pick that out. Back to the azure blue. I mean, that kind of rich, vibrant blue is quite nice. Don't want to use too much of it. In certain places it works quite nicely. Just having, I don't know how well the camera picks this up, but just having that little bit of the azure blue in there really helps to kind of add that contrast to the colours, which is what you're looking for, like I say, to make sure your paintings aren't looking too flat. So remember what I said before, if you saw the previous lesson, working back to front and top to bottom quite often in the painting, certainly back to front, so you want to work on the background first, and then the midground, and then in the foreground. So we've got a distant row of trees there that's quite hazy in the sunshine, so we'll put those in now. So it's just a mixture of, you want that colour to be fairly cool. It's on the bluey brown side of the spectrum, so we're just going to mix up a light colour. So you want a fair bit of titanium white in there to knock that back. So just adjust it little bits of paint at a time. Don't ever go too much. Just adding little bits as you adjust. So I'm just adding a bit more of the French ultramarine in there, because it's, like I say, that in the distance it's on the blue side of the spectrum. Probably even a bit more blue in there, a little bit more of the burnt umber. If things are too, when you put them on, if they're not quite right, you can paint over them. Sometimes you'll need to let it dry. Probably a bit more blue, probably a little bit more to knock it back a little bit. But adding that white and the blue will knock it back, because in the foreground we're going to have nice rich greens, so you don't want them fighting. You want this to look like it's in the background. And that's the way to do it, is to cool those colours down. And then you won't have them fighting with each other, because that's the last thing we want. You know, again, that's another thing that will stop your paintings looking too flat, is having that balance between the cool and the warm colours. You know, essentially, for the most part, your cool colours are going to what's going to make the painting recede, and that's where you want your distant kind of subjects, objects, to have those cool colours, so that they're not back in the painting, they're not trying to come forward in the painting. Because as soon as they start trying to, if you start warming them up, then they'll just automatically to the eye come forward. So just when you're mixing paints, always remember that. So it's the blues that are going to knock things back, and also adding the titanium white as well, just to kind of desaturate those colours. It's really important. So what I've actually done, as we've gone from right to left, because the right hand side's a little bit closer as you're looking at the photo, so there's a little bit more saturation. As we've gone left, I've added a little bit more blue, a little bit more of the titanium white, just knocking it back so it keeps that kind of distance going. And that kind of works really well, and you'll see when we do the foreground, those background trees now will be very much visually pushed behind the foreground. As I say, that's just something you really want to be doing and bearing in mind when you're doing landscapes, is think about the perspective, the distance, and where you want things positioned. So we've got that in, so that's working quite well now. Again, you know, for those of you interested, I'm just using the weasel hair brush again. This is a size 5 filbert design, and they're just good brushes for kind of a range of different brush strokes and techniques and things. You know, you can use whatever you're comfortable with, but people have asked me in the past whether I prefer short-handled or long-handled brushes. These ones are fairly long-handled brushes. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, they're fairly long, but really that's down to personal preference. I mean, you know, what you use. When I go down to the fine details with the rigger brushes, I prefer short handles, but with the bigger brushes, the long handles work really well. You can hold them, some people hold them right at the end, like that. I mean, I tend to hold them almost like a pencil, I suppose, so about halfway down. It just gives you a bit more control, a bit more freedom and things for doing that. So anyway, we'll move on to the mid-ground grass here. And again, we don't want too much saturation in this colour. It's we want to keep it firmly in that mid-ground area. So what I've got here is a bit of the Naples yellow, a bit of the light green. Again, this is one of those things where you're going to mix some colours up, and we're going to see how they look. I might need to, because it's a reasonably warm colour, I'm probably going to add some yellow ochre to this. So we'll get a bit of yellow ochre in there. But I've done a video on mixing greens if people want to take a look at that, just to see how I do that. So we'll look at that. That's maybe we'll put it on and see what it looks like. Needs to be a bit lighter. Might need a little bit of cadmium yellow in there. Yeah, it's a little bit flat looking. So adding a bit of the cad yellow in there just warms it up a bit. Again, we just keep mixing and testing on your palette there, and then you can put it onto the canvas. So just adjusting it as I go. But as I said, you don't want too much saturation in the midground either. You want to keep that saturation kind of down a little, otherwise it will start jumping forward in your painting. So that's like what I would call kind of a mid-tone as such, you know, in terms of how much warmth and cool it's got in it. You know, you're not too warm and you're not too cool with the colour. Like I say, the yellow ochre is what knocks some of that vibrancy out of the colour to tone it down, which is what we want for this part of the painting. I'm just referring to the photo at all times as I'm doing this. You know, some of this stuff's going to be covered up by trees and bushes, but just get that all in. The painting, I'm still working in one session here, so the paint above is still wet. So just be a little bit careful when you're doing that, just you're not dragging too much of the paint from other parts into what you're doing. It's just something to be aware of, you know. If you're letting stuff dry, obviously you haven't got to worry about that, but this was one of those lessons I'm doing just to show you can paint pretty realistically, sort of fairly quickly. So that's the grass done there in the midground. Again, you know, not too much saturation, bit of warmth in there just to bring it to the right position. And now we're going to work on this part of the painting. So we've got the reed beds here, we've got all the bankside foliage and things, so we'll do that next and then we'll see how it goes. Okay, so now we're getting on to the bushes and the bankside foliage in the foreground here. We can now step up the saturation of the colours and make everything much warmer, much more saturated with colour. So I'm going to mix a bit of, just to get the darks in, a bit of the burnt umber with the hooker's green, a bit of the French ultramarine in there. Gives a nice dark green. You know, I do use blacks, ivory black and things like that to darken colours off, and it does work, but sometimes it makes your colours look a little bit on the flat side. So one way around that, if you want to mix your own blacks, is to use things like French ultramarine and burnt umber, and that kind of gives you a bit more of a kind of a warmer tone to your blacks, which I think is really good, really useful. I mean, so I will use ivory black to darken stuff, but I do like trying to mix my own. You can add a bit of, you know, things like crimson, alizarin into the mix as well, or you know, the greens, anything really. But if you use burnt umber and French ultramarine as your basis for your blacks, and then add colours as and when you need them, it's just a nicer way to get, I think, a bit of a better tone to your colours. It's just personal preference. Some people, you know, like I say, are happy using ivory black, and I will use it in my paintings for sure. But it's kind of a sort of situation where there's a time and a place for it, I think. And I tend never to use ivory black straight out of the tube for any applications. It just looks too stark, I think. So anyway, the bank side here, you just got basically loads of kind of bushes and rushes and things curving up. But you got, well, because the sun's coming from over here, it's going to cast shadows in the kind of the back end of these bushes. So we're just trying to get the dark bits and the light bits together there. So just plenty of that French ultramarine burnt umber with the hooker's green there, just to create these darker areas. And we may need to darken them off more, and if I find that it's not quite dark enough, then the old ivory black will come out, I'm sure, at some point. But for now, this is fine for what I need. And again, you know, when you're trying to do realistic paintings, you know, you might not necessarily get the colours and the balance right first time, and that's fine. You know, just be aware of that when you're painting, and don't necessarily expect to get everything right first time. You can adjust things as you go. You'll put stuff on and take that step back that I've always talked about in my lessons, so you can see how things are in relation to each other, and that's a really important thing to do. And when I've done this layer and it's dried off, I'll show you. We've got some trees to put in, and that'll be the final layer, I should imagine, as we go. And that'll probably be the only time. I mean, I might have to let some of the rest of it dry, but that's going to be the main bit where I'm going to have to let the painting dry, I think. And a lot of this side of the bank that I'm working on here will be in shade. And we can put the highlights on afterwards. You know, we might be what I would call a two-stage painting. So we can do the bulk of the work in one sitting, and then we'll let the layers dry, and that's when we'll do that final layer. You know, as always, the photo is just a guide. I'm in no way, shape or form am I going to copy this slavishly. As I've said before, I think in previous videos, life is far too short for that, for me personally. But I do want that sense of realism in there. So I've just mixed a little bit of the light green into the mix there. And that just helps with the warmth. But we're going to go lighter than that as we go. But like I say, for now we're just putting in these kind of mid-tones and the darker tones. And a lot of this will change, and we'll reassess as we go. I'm just looking where the light's hitting the bank over here now. And I'm probably going to have to strengthen some of these darks up because there's a fair contrast between the darks and lights. The Viridian green, or the Viridian hue there that I've just mixed in, it's quite good for the highlights. I'm probably going to leave a lot of that till the end. It's just a nice rich colour. So I'll stick with the burnt umber and the sap green and the hooker's green there for the time being. Again, we'll see how we go. We might have to let some of this dry before we can put in real detail here. But at the moment we're just sticking with a sort of bigger brush. I'm just trying to keep this fairly loose really.